In the last days of summer 1944, something extraordinary was happening in Europe, something so rare that most wars never experience it at all. The war was no longer advancing. It was collapsing. An American army was moving east so fast that maps became obsolete. Town names were crossed out and replaced almost daily. Enemy columns clogged the roads in flames, not from airstrikes, but from panic. Vehicles abandoned, fuel dumped, weapons left where they fell. Soldiers surrendered not after battles, but before them, raising white cloths simply because there was nowhere left to run. At the center of it all stood one relentless commander, watching history accelerate beyond anyone's expectations. He understood something few dared to say out loud. This was not just progress. This was a moment, a narrow, fragile window when the enemy was no longer capable of resistance, only flight. He wrote privately that if momentum held, the war might be over before autumn turned cold. But history is not decided only by what happens at the front. Far from the dust and noise, behind closed doors and polished desks, another reality was taking shape. While tanks raced forward and soldiers sensed the end was near, conversations were unfolding that had nothing to do with rivers crossed or enemies broken. They were about balance, about pride, about who would finish the war, and who would be remembered for it. What happened next would never be announced to the public. There would be no speech, no explanation to the men risking their lives at the front. Just a quiet decision, one that would slow the war, harden the enemy, and cost lives long after this perfect moment had passed. This is the story of the week victory was within reach, and why it was taken away. If stories like this matter to you, stories about the hidden decisions that shaped history, subscribe to the channel and support our work so we can keep bringing you the truths behind the battles. Quick question for you. Do you think the war could have ended sooner if momentum had not been stopped? A. Yes, the opportunity was real. No, logistics made it impossible. Comment A or B below. What unfolded next did not resemble the kind of war most people imagine. There were no carefully drawn lines on maps, no set-piece battles announced in advance. This was not two armies testing strength against strength. This was a pursuit, raw, relentless, and unforgiving. The advancing force was no longer measuring success by ground taken, but by how fast the enemy was unraveling. Roads told the story before any report could. Trucks burned where they had been abandoned. Artillery sat silent, crews gone. Fuel drums were left untouched, not because supplies were plentiful, but because fear had outrun planning. Entire units dissolved between nightfall and dawn. Veteran soldiers sensed it immediately. This was not resistance being worn down. This was an army losing the ability to function. Command structures failed. Orders arrived too late or not at all. Officers could not find their men, and men no longer knew who they answered to. Surrender came in waves, not out of cowardice, but exhaustion and inevitability. For the commander driving this advance, speed became a form of mercy as well as strategy. Every mile gained without a fight spared lives on both sides. Every hour denied the enemy time to regroup was an hour closer to ending the war itself. He understood that collapse, once interrupted, could reverse. Panic could harden into resolve. Chaos could be reshaped into defense. This was why he pushed so hard. Not for glory, not for headlines, but because moments like this do not last. History rarely offers clean endings. When it does, they come disguised as chaos, demanding courage to recognize them for what they are. This was not a battle to be won. It was an ending to be seized, before it slipped away. There are moments in war when defeat arrives long before it is recognized, not with a surrender ceremony or formal announcement, but quietly, when an army loses the invisible things that make resistance possible: coordination, confidence, the belief that tomorrow can still be controlled. That was the enemy's condition now. On paper, defenses still existed. Lines were drawn. Positions were assigned. Reports insisted the situation was difficult but manageable. But reality at the front told a different story. The structures that sustained resistance had hollowed out from within. Orders traveled slower than fear. Reinforcements existed only in theory. What remained was not a defensive system, but the appearance of one. The commander at the center of the American advance understood this distinction with unsettling clarity. He read intelligence not as numbers, but as symptoms. Units manned by those never meant to hold a line. Fortifications without depth, without reserves, without the confidence to absorb a shock. This was not an enemy preparing to fight. It was an enemy hoping the war would pause long enough to breathe. And that was the great illusion. Defeat, when unacknowledged, is dangerous. It invites hesitation on one side and false hope on the other. The enemy still believed time could save them, that if they could just slow the advance, just a little, the machinery of war might reassemble itself. They did not yet understand how close they were to the edge. The commander did. He had seen it before in history and in training. The brief instant when an opponent is still standing, still armed, but already beaten in every way that matters. When victory depends not on force, but on recognition. This was that moment, and moments like this do not announce themselves. They disappear. The plan, when stripped of all decoration, was almost brutally plain. That was what frightened people most. There were no elaborate diagrams, no carefully staged pauses, no expectation that the war would politely slow down to match supply tables. The commander believed that complexity was a luxury reserved for stable situations, and nothing about this moment was stable. The enemy was fractured, disoriented, and living on borrowed time. To hesitate now, he believed, was to rebuild the very resistance that had already collapsed. His proposal rested on a single conviction. Momentum is not something you regain once surrendered. It must be spent while it exists. The army would continue forward without pause, driving straight through the last fragile barriers and into the enemy's core, before organization, morale, and command could be restored. Speed would replace mass. Decision would replace caution. The objections came quickly. Lines on maps were traced in red, highlighting exposed flanks. Supply officers spoke of fuel, bridges, maintenance, and distance. Others warned of political consequences if one force advanced too far ahead of its allies. These were not irrational concerns. They were reasonable, sensible, safe. And that was precisely the problem. The commander understood that war rarely rewards what is reasonable. It rewards what is timely. He did not deny the risks, he ranked them. A vulnerable flank could be reinforced later. A stretched supply line could be repaired. But a broken enemy, given time, would heal in ways no army could easily undo. What unsettled his peers was not the danger of the plan, but its clarity. It left no room for gradualism, no place to hide behind procedure. If it failed, it would fail visibly. If it succeeded, it would end the war in a way no committee could control. That kind of simplicity is terrifying because it forces a choice. 5. The order that changed everything. The order did not arrive with drama. There was no confrontation, no urgent call warning of disaster. It came quietly, wrapped in routine language, as if it were just another administrative adjustment in a long war of paperwork and procedure. Fuel allocations were revised. Priorities were reassigned. Movement schedules were temporarily adjusted. At first, few grasped what it meant. Armies are accustomed to friction. Delays happen. Supplies arrive late. Commanders adapt. But within hours, the truth became unavoidable. Vehicles that should have been rolling forward sat silent. Columns scheduled to advance never moved. The flow of momentum, the one thing holding the enemy in collapse, was cut at its source. The commander read the message twice, then again. Not because it was unclear, but because it was unbelievable. Nothing at the front justified it. There had been no reversal, no unexpected resistance, no emergency demanding sacrifice. The enemy had not earned this pause. It had been given. For the men on the ground, the effect was immediate and demoralizing. Soldiers who had felt the war slipping toward an end now felt it stiffen again, like a door slowly closing. Crews waited beside machines built for speed, watching hours pass that could never be recovered. War teaches soldiers to accept danger, but it does not teach them how to accept paralysis. The commander understood the deeper consequence at once. This was not merely a halt in movement. It was an interruption of psychology. The enemy would notice. Confusion would give way to relief. Fear would turn into calculation. A defeated force, if allowed to breathe, does not remain defeated. In his private reflections, he would later write that this was the moment the war changed shape. Not because of something the enemy did, but because of something his own side chose not to do. History often turns not on loud decisions, but on quiet ones. This was one of them. What stunned the commander most was not that the advance had been stopped, but why. As fragments of explanation filtered down, it became clear this decision had not been shaped by terrain, enemy strength, or battlefield necessity. It had been shaped far from the dust and danger, in rooms where maps were clean and consequences felt abstract. This was not a military calculation. It was a political one. The war was being fought by an alliance, and alliances demand balance as much as victory. Other commanders wanted their moment, their breakthrough, their place in history. Other governments wanted assurance that the end of the war would reflect shared sacrifice, not the dominance of a single army or a single nation. Momentum at the front was no longer the only currency that mattered. Perception had entered the equation. The commander understood the logic, but rejected its cost. Wars are not won by symmetry. They are won by exploiting imbalance. Yet here, imbalance had become unacceptable. Allowing one force to surge ahead threatened unity, threatened pride, threatened carefully maintained appearances. So success itself was restrained. What made this decision especially bitter was its distance from reality. The men freezing beside their silent vehicles were not debating alliance politics. They were watching an enemy they had broken begin, slowly, to recover. Every hour of restraint made the war harder, not safer. The commander had sworn to fight the enemy, not manage egos. But now he saw the truth that history often conceals. Wars are shaped as much by the fears of allies as by the actions of adversaries. Victory had become something to be shared, not seized. This was the moment when strategy yielded to diplomacy, and when momentum, once lost, began slipping into memory. The resources taken from the halted advance did not disappear. They were redirected, deliberately, purposefully, toward another vision of how the war should end. This new plan was bold in a different way. It promised elegance instead of pressure, spectacle instead of inevitability. Its architects believed that one dramatic stroke could do what grinding momentum could not: shock the enemy into collapse. It was a strategy built on surprise, precision, and timing so exact that there would be no margin for error. And it required fuel. A great deal of it. The irony was impossible to ignore. The very momentum that had proven the enemy was breaking was now being harvested to power a gamble that had not yet been tested. Trucks, gasoline, priority rail space, All were pulled away from a force already inside the enemy's decision loop and sent elsewhere, to create a breakthrough that existed only in planning rooms and confident briefings. To the commander who had been stopped, this felt like replacing certainty with hope. His advance did not depend on perfect coordination. It thrived on disorder, the enemy's disorder. The new plan, by contrast, demanded flawless execution from the first hour to the last. Any delay, any resistance, any miscalculation would unravel it. But the gamble had something his success did not: appeal. It promised a clean ending, a dramatic narrative, a victory that could be explained in a single headline. It offered control, symmetry, and the comforting sense that the war would end according to design rather than circumstance. Wars, however, do not reward what looks good on paper. As fuel flowed north and east, the halted army remained still, watching opportunity drain away one tanker at a time. The commander understood what this meant before the first reports returned. If the gamble failed, the enemy would not simply survive. It would return stronger. This was the moment when momentum was traded for ambition, and when a war that might have ended cleanly chose a far bloodier path instead. While one army waited, the enemy worked. The pause that seemed administrative on Allied paperwork felt miraculous on the other side of the line. What had been panic began to harden into purpose. What had been chaos slowly found structure. 2 weeks, just 14 days, became the most valuable gift the enemy could have received. Rail lines that had been clogged with refugees now carried troops. Units that had been scattered reassembled under familiar commanders. Veterans were rushed forward, replacing boys and clerks who had never been meant to hold a line. Artillery that had been abandoned was dragged back into position. Ammunition stocks grew. Defensive plans were rewritten with sober realism instead of desperation. Most importantly, confidence returned. Not confidence that victory was possible, but confidence that survival was. And in war, survival is enough. Once an army believes it can hold, even briefly, it begins to fight differently. Fear gives way to calculation. Retreat turns into resistance. The commander understood this transformation with painful clarity. He could see it in intercepted messages, in the stiffening posture of enemy patrols, in the sudden discipline of positions that had been empty days earlier. The enemy had not become strong, but it had become organized. An organization, even in weakness, is deadly. This was the cruel paradox of the halt. The enemy had been defeated in motion, but revived at rest. The pause allowed the very thing momentum had denied them: time to think, time to plan, time to recover the will to resist. After the war, enemy officers would speak of those 2 weeks with disbelief, even gratitude. They had expected destruction. Instead, they were given space. They did not credit Allied restraint to mercy or strategy, but to incomprehensible fortune. The commander saw it for what it was: a second chance handed to an opponent who had already lost the first. In war, such chances are rare, and when given, they are almost always paid for in blood later. 2 weeks did not change the outcome of the war. They changed its cost. When the gamble failed, the failure did not arrive all at once. It unfolded quietly, in fragments: missed objectives, delayed timetables, reports that ended with uncertainty instead of confidence. What had been promised as a decisive stroke began to feel fragile, then strained, then dangerously exposed. The gamble had assumed speed where resistance now existed. It had counted on surprise at a moment when the enemy, given time, had learned how to brace itself. Small delays cascaded into large problems. Units meant to link up did not. Timelines slipped by hours, then days. What was designed to move like a blade began to stall like a lever, with nothing left to push against. From afar, the language remained optimistic. Briefings spoke of adjustments and temporary setbacks, but at the front, the reality was unmistakable. The breakthrough was not breaking through. Instead of collapse, there was containment. Instead of shock, there was resistance, uneven, imperfect, but real. For the commander who had been forced to wait, the news carried no satisfaction, only dread. This was the outcome he had feared, not because the alternative plan had failed, but because its failure meant something far worse. The enemy had survived long enough to adapt, and adaptation in war is often more dangerous than strength. Casualties mounted without clarity of purpose. Gains, where they occurred, lacked strategic weight. The operation consumed time, fuel, and lives, but produced no ending. The war did not shorten, it thickened. The tragedy was not that a bold plan had failed. Bold plans fail all the time. The tragedy was what had been traded away to attempt it. A real collapse had been exchanged for a hypothetical one. Momentum had been sacrificed for design. When the gamble finally stalled beyond recovery, there was no announcement, no admission, only a quiet shift back to grinding reality. The war resumed its slower, bloodier rhythm, and the commander knew something that could not be undone had already been lost. The chance to end the war before it learned how to fight back. When the advance finally resumed, it felt like stepping into a different war. The roads were the same, the towns familiar, but the enemy was no longer running. Positions that had once been empty now answered with fire. What had been improvised defenses had matured into layered resistance. Every mile forward demanded preparation, coordination, and sacrifice. The war, once fluid, had turned rigid. For the soldiers, the change was immediate and brutal. Movement slowed. Losses rose. Progress was measured not in miles per day, but in yards gained at a cost that could be felt in every unit. Battles that should never have existed now had names, timelines, and casualty lists. What momentum once spared, hesitation now demanded. The commander watched this transformation with a sense of quiet rage. He recognized the pattern all too well. An enemy allowed to recover does not simply survive, it adapts. It learns how to bleed you back. The pause had not changed the enemy's fate, but it had changed the price of defeating them. Each assault now required artillery preparation. Each crossing demanded engineers and smoke and time. The simplicity of pursuit was gone, replaced by the slow mathematics of attrition. Young men paid for weeks of delay with months of fighting. Victories came, but they were heavy, and they felt nothing like the ending that had once seemed so close. What haunted the commander most was not the losses themselves, but their cause. These were not casualties taken to break a strong enemy. They were casualties taken because a broken enemy had been allowed to stand back up. Blood was being spent to reclaim time that had already been owned and then surrendered. Wars always demand sacrifice, but some sacrifices carry a particular weight, the weight of knowing they were avoidable. The pause had turned momentum into memory, and memory into mourning. By the time the front moved again with purpose, winter was approaching, resistance was hardened, and the war had chosen its longer path. The blood that followed did not change the outcome. It only delayed the ending and deepened the cost. History never answers the questions that matter most. It records what happened, catalogs the decisions, measures the outcomes. But it does not tell us what might have been, only what followed. And in this story, what followed was victory delayed, resistance revived, and a war that demanded far more blood than it had needed to. The commander carried that knowledge quietly. He did not claim certainty, only conviction. He believed the enemy had been beaten before it understood its own defeat. He believed momentum, once lost, could not be repurchased at the same price. And he believed that the pause, so easily justified, so neatly explained, had reshaped the final year of the war. Others disagreed. They pointed to logistics, to alliance politics, to the risks of advancing too far, too fast. They argued that caution had prevented disaster. And perhaps they were right. History allows room for that defense because history is written in results, not possibilities. But there is another ledger history keeps, though it is harder to read. It is written in the names of the dead, in winters spent fighting battles that did not need to exist, in families who waited longer than necessary for the war to end. Those costs are real, even if their causes remain debated. The question is not whether the war would have ended differently. The question is whether it could have ended sooner and at less cost. Whether one decision, made far from the front, traded speed for symmetry and lives for balance. The commander never stopped asking himself that question. He asked it not as a strategist, but as a man who had seen opportunity up close and watched it slip away. He knew history would never rule in his favor or against him. It would simply move on. And perhaps that is the hardest truth of all. Wars end. Nations rebuild. Arguments fade. But the consequences of a single pause at the wrong moment echo long after the guns fall silent. History does not answer the question. It leaves it to us. In the end, the commander's story was not defined by defeat, nor even by victory. It was defined by a moment, brief, fragile, and irreversible, when history opened a door and then quietly closed it again. He had seen the enemy break before it understood it was broken. He had felt momentum in his hands, not as a theory, but as a living force, one that moved faster than orders, faster than politics, faster than fear. And then he watched that force drained away, not by the enemy, but by decisions made in safety, far from consequence. The war was still won, but it was won slowly, painfully, and at a cost that haunted him long after the fighting ended. What makes this story endure is not the argument over strategy. It is the human truth beneath it. Opportunities in life, like in war, do not announce how rare they are while they exist. They appear ordinary in the moment, risky to seize, inconvenient to support. Only later do we recognize them for what they were, turning points that demanded courage, clarity, and decisiveness. The lesson reaches far beyond the battlefield. In careers, relationships, leadership, and personal growth, momentum matters. When progress is real and conditions are favorable, hesitation can be more dangerous than action. Waiting for perfect certainty often means surrendering the very advantage that made success possible. At the same time, this story warns us that decisions shaped by ego, fear of imbalance, or the need to please everyone rarely produce the best outcomes. The commander's legacy is not about being right or wrong. It is about understanding the cost of delay and the responsibility that comes with recognizing a decisive moment when it appears. Quick question for you. When opportunity appears in life, what matters more? A. Acting decisively, even with risk. B. Waiting until everything feels secure. Comment A or B below. And what do you think? Was the commander's greatest mistake his pause, or was it unavoidable given the circumstances? Share your perspective in the comments so others can learn from your view. If stories like this make you think deeper about history, leadership, and life, subscribe to the channel and support us so we can keep creating powerful content like this next time.